time, not just for one country, but really for the whole world. This is a very special seminar because we were to announce it last week, just on the day when the president of the Russian Federation announced the new wave of the armed aggression against Ukraine. And on the one hand, the issues of the webinar couldn't be more topical and needing of discussion. On the other hand, I really thought that neither the organizing team nor the participants would be able to really gather in such a dynamic situation. But I'm very grateful that we actually did it. And symbolically, yesterday, also the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court said that the court was one step closer to investigating the alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated in the Russia-Ukraine armed conflict. What does it mean for international justice? What does it mean for the justice avenues for Ukrainians, and not only in The Hague, but perhaps in a hypothetical hybrid or specialized tribunal, or in the other proceedings in other states under the universal jurisdiction principles? We will discuss today. We will discuss today what lessons and what myths we have from Nuremberg and how that should be taken into account for the settlement of this very unsettling new wave of aggression. We will start with our first presenter. This is Professor Francine Hirsch, who is kindly joining us from Wisconsin. And I actually virtually met her during the presentation of her brilliant book on the Soviet legacy of Nuremberg, which uncovered the totally new aspect of the International Military Tribunal's history. And just yesterday, Francine also published a very insightful piece on Nuremberg and memory politics of Russia. So today she will comment on both. And Francine, thank you very much for joining. Over to you, please. You're still muted.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much for organizing this and for having me here today. I, like the rest of the world, have been really focused on the invasion of Ukraine with great worry and concern, and with also just great admiration for the people of Ukraine right now. And so for those of you in the audience, when Katerina invited me to do this months ago, the plan was to talk about my book, Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, and I'll still do some of that today, but I also want to talk about the present and about how Putin has been misusing the language of Nuremberg and the Nuremberg verdict in his propaganda. Right? As we know, he has falsely accused the Kiev regime of committing crimes against peaceful people and of carrying out the genocide of Russians. And here he's intentionally using the language of Soviet and international war crimes trials after the Second World War. And he's invoked the Nuremberg verdict to rewrite the history of World War II. And this all is part of Putin's information war. And it's really important to keep pushing back. In earlier talks, I've highlighted the successes of Nuremberg. I've talked about what it did for the creation of a system of post-war international law. This past week, though, I've been thinking a lot about Nuremberg's failures, too, and about what was lost with a verdict that only recognized the crimes of the European Axis powers. By now, we're all, of course, familiar with Putin's rhetoric of denazification. What might be less well known is that last week, 2 days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Russian State Duma introduced a bill attaching fines and prison sentences to a 2021 law banning, and I'm quoting here, any public attempt to equate the aims and actions of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany during World War II. This actually marks the culmination of a decade-long effort to impose total control over how the war is talked about and remembered in Russia. One of the bill's co-authors, Alexei Pushkov, has described this memory law as a moral imperative. And one of its stated aims is to prevent people, and I'm quoting here again, from insulting the memory of the defenders of the fatherland. Now, of course, Russia is not alone here with a memory law. Poland has a similar law criticizing, and I'll quote, public speech claiming that the Polish state was responsible or co-responsible for Nazi crimes committed by the Third Reich. But Russia's memory law has its own nuances. Pushkov and others have argued that the legal basis of this law can be found in the verdict of the Nuremberg Tribunal. Why are they looking to Nuremberg? And why does this matter now? So I'll come back to this in a bit, but for now, I will tell you a bit about my book, Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, because I think at least it'll give you a sense of how I'm approaching these kinds of questions. As you all know, the Nuremberg trials, also known as the International Military Tribunal, took place from November 1945 to October 1946 in occupied Germany. The United States, France, Britain, and the Soviet Union tried 22 former Nazi leaders, including Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, and Johann von Ribbentrop, for conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And this language is really important, and we'll talk about it more today as well. They also tried 6 Nazi organizations, including the Gestapo and the SS. Well, I began the research for this book project back in 2006. And in the English language literature at that time, the Soviet contribution to the Nuremberg trials and to the development of post-war international law was barely talked about, partly because of restricted access to the former Soviet archives during the Cold War, and partly because of discomfort, and I think understandably so, with some of this historical complexity. Because the Soviets were carrying out deportations in Poland and in Hungary, even as the IMT was hearing evidence about the Nazis. And there were episodes involving the Soviets at Nuremberg that, quite frankly, everyone wanted to forget right away, including the Soviet effort to use the IMT to blame one of their own war crimes, the Katyn massacre of thousands of Polish prisoners of war, on the Nazis. In a more general sense, too, though, the contribution of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union to Nuremberg, it sort of upends the myth of Nuremberg as wholly grounded in liberal ideas about justice and the law. So I argue in my book that we need the whole story, and that if Nuremberg is going to offer us meaningful lessons, we need to understand what actually happened. And with this in mind, I aim to bring the Soviets fully into the picture, and I drew on evidence from 5 Moscow archives to do so. Evidence that included things like secret telegrams, letters, surveillance reports, list of possible witnesses and their depositions, transcripts of 2 of the Soviet Union's secret Nuremberg commissions, and documents like marked up copies of the indictment, the judgment, and things like this that the Soviets secretly smuggled back to Nuremberg and that are covered with Stalin and Molotov's handwriting. These documents showed the tremendous Soviet contribution to the framework of the Nuremberg trials and the critical Soviet contribution to the prosecution's case, especially to the record of the Holocaust. But they also showed the many ways in which Soviet participation threatened to undermine the IMT's legitimacy really right from the start. So the book uses these and other materials to retell the story of the trials, beginning in the darkest days of the war. It covers the road to Nuremberg, focusing in on the contentious negotiations about the Nuremberg Charter and indictment. And then it takes readers through the prosecution's case, the defense case, the organization's case, and the judgment. It ends with a chapter on Nuremberg's aftermath, looking at its legacy in the post-war period and its role in deliberations about international law and human rights. Along the way, I make a number of arguments, and I'll very quickly recap 3 of them before coming back around to this question about the Nuremberg verdict. First of all, without the Soviets, the Nuremberg trials likely would not have happened. The Soviets took up the question of Nazi criminality during the darkest days of the war, prompted by the brutality of the Nazi assault and occupation. In October 1942, the Soviets were out in front calling for a special international tribunal and inviting all interested governments to cooperate in bringing Hitler, Goering, Hess, and other Nazi leaders to justice. The United States and Britain were actually slow to come on board, and so the Soviets went down their own path. Even as the Soviets, though, went down their own path, the Soviet lawyer Aaron Chayinin from Moscow's Institute of Law influenced the international discussion about war crimes through his writings. Chayinin argued, and this is important, that the planning and waging of wars of aggression should be punished as crimes against peace. He also argued that Nazi leaders could and should be tried, the leaders, for participating in a criminal conspiracy. And he challenged the defense of following orders. And I think these are ideas that are obviously very important today as well. Chayinin set these ideas out in a book, which made its way across Europe to Britain, where it was translated into English and discussed by the United Nations War Crimes Commission, which the Soviets did not participate in. It then crossed the Atlantic to the United States, where it landed at the White House after also being discussed by the War Department. After the victory, when the other Allied powers came around to the idea of an international tribunal, Trianon helped shape its framework. He was one of the 2 representatives that the Soviets sent to the 4-Power London Conference in the summer of 1945. And crimes against peace, his contribution became one of the 3 categories of crimes set out in the Charter's Article 6, along with war crimes and crimes against humanity. Okay. The book's second key argument is that the Soviets had no idea what they had set in motion and were greatly handicapped on the international stage by the constraints of Stalinism. The Soviets thought that Nuremberg would be a show trial. They took Nazi guilt as a given, and they were expecting guilty verdicts down the line. They certainly did not expect the defendants to be allowed to take the stand in their own defense or to be allowed to call witnesses. Soviet expectations shaped their choice of personnel for Nuremberg. Almost all members of the Soviet legal team, including the Soviet chief prosecutor and the Soviet judge, were connected to the Soviet show trials of the 1930s. And Soviet chose Andrei Vyshinsky, a name that might be familiar to some of you, because he had been the prosecutor in the Moscow trials, to head a secret Moscow-based Nuremberg Commission for overseeing Soviet participation. The Soviets thought that the victors would control the script. They were so confident of this that they initially did not tell Rudenko, the chief prosecutor, about the secret protocols to the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, in which Hitler and Stalin had agreed to divide up Poland and the Baltic states. They assumed that Rudenko did not need to know. They were so confident of controlling the script that they insisted on including the Katyn massacre, their own war crime, in the indictment. The Soviets had reason, though, not to worry about these things, and I think this is the thing maybe to focus on. The Nuremberg Charter had established that the IMT would address only European Axis crimes, and there could have been no other way, right? I don't know that in Nuremberg trials, it wouldn't have happened had this not been a given from the very start. What's more, the prosecutors had agreed before the trial started to work together to keep awkward topics like their own war crimes out of the courtroom. And the Soviets actually referred to this in their documents as their gentleman's agreement. The Western judges were not on board with this. They worried about allegations of victor's justice, and they actually ended up giving significant leeway to the defendants who did what they could to put forward their own narrative about Nazism and the war. Okay, the third argument is that by the end of the Nuremberg trials, Nuremberg had become a Cold War battleground. And this helps explain why Nuremberg's promise was never fully realized afterwards in the decades that followed. All 4 powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, wanted to use the IMT to bring the Nazis to justice and to strengthen their international influence. They had different ideas about justice, and they had different and competing visions for the post-war order. While the prosecution presented its case from November 1945 through February 1946, tensions among the 4 powers were mostly kept under wraps. Then in March of 1946, the Cold War blew into the Nuremberg courtroom. On March 5th, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave what we now know as his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, calling for Anglo-American resistance to Soviet tyranny. And the very next day, the defense case began. Churchill's speech energized the defense, which upped its effort to drive a wedge between the Soviets and the Western powers. And the defense had great success in the weeks and months that followed. Goering insisted that Germany had launched a preventive war against the Soviet Union and not a war of aggression. And by the way, this is some of Putin's talk. We hear, again, this talk about a defensive or a preventive war. Ribbentrop riveted the courtroom with his description of the secret protocols, and he argued that if Germany was guilty of crimes against peace, then the Soviets were too. Goering's attorney also petitioned for witnesses to counter Soviet charges about Katyn, and the 3 Western judges allowed this. The witnesses cast enough doubt on the Soviet version of events that no mention of Katyn appeared in the judgment. Now, the after-hours socializing kept Nuremberg on track. But back in Moscow, Soviet leaders interpreted all decisions by the judges that went against Soviet interests as part of an Anglo-American anti-Soviet plot. And Moscow, of course, was also disappointed with the verdicts. 12 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, 3 were acquitted, and the others received prison sentences. Now, I want to come back around here to this question of Nuremberg's legacy. Bringing in the Soviets, it's important to do so. We need the whole version of things. And it reminds us that the IMT was not simply a result of Western leadership and liberal idealism. Nuremberg involved difficult negotiations and compromises among the victors. And its achievements, I still think that its achievements were significant. The IMT created a comprehensive record of the crimes of the Third Reich. It laid out the foundation, too, for new laws and institutions devoted to the protection of human rights. And all of this matters. All of this matters a great deal. But the IMT, of course, only tried the crimes of the European Axis powers. And the Nuremberg verdict blamed Nazi Germany alone for certain Soviet German crimes against peace. This is why Putin is able to point to the Nuremberg verdict. And this is why he does so in order to try to justify a distorted version of history. The Soviet Union, as one of the 4 countries of the prosecution, was not held accountable at Nuremberg for the secret protocols. It was not held accountable for its invasion of Poland in September 1939. It was not held accountable for its invasion and annexation of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia less than a year later. And it was not held accountable for the war crimes that followed, including the Katyn massacre. Last September, the Russian Foreign Ministry doubled down on its characterization of the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939 as a quote unquote campaign of liberation that was undertaken to supposedly, and again, I'm quoting, to protect Belarusians and Ukrainians after the invasion by Germany. And the ministry accused scholars who discuss Soviet-German collaboration of smearing the memory of the war. The threat now of jail or fines imposed by the Duma's new bill will further suppress the truth about the Soviet invasion of Poland and about the arrests, deportations, show trials, and executions that followed. This especially matters now. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has important parallels with the Soviet invasion of Poland and the Baltic states. Putin in 2022, like Stalin in 1939, is attempting to reconfigure the geopolitical balance of power. Putin, like Stalin, is attempting to enlarge his state and expand its influence with revanchist claims to territories that had once been part of a larger empire. Putin, like Stalin, has launched a war of aggression while calling it something else, while calling it a special operation aimed at aiding civilians and supposedly restoring the peace. Putin's war on Ukraine is being supported by an information war about the present and also about the past. We can expect him to continue to hide behind this Nuremberg verdict, these calls to the Nuremberg verdict, in talking about Soviet history of the Second World War. I think it's our job to acknowledge Nuremberg's flaws, to acknowledge what the verdict did not cover, and that pointed to the Nuremberg verdict as the truth of it all, right, will never be enough. It's also our job to continue to call out the misuse and the abuse of Nuremberg's language. At the same time, and I feel this very, very strongly, this is a moment to prove that Nuremberg matters, that we as an international community believe in the Nuremberg principles, and that we as the international community take a different lesson from Putin about Nuremberg, right, and its lessons and its legacy. Putin and his generals have committed crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. They must be held accountable for this. So that's, thanks. Those are those are my comments. And again, I just want to say it feels so strange to be talking in, I mean, concrete but abstract terms while knowing what's happening right now. And yeah, so as a historian and a scholar, and as a person, just really, just my heart goes out to everyone in Ukraine right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Francine. And I've already have so many questions noted to you. I just wanted to say something which I forgot to say when I was making an introduction, is that I think one of the most impressive conversations that discussion on Nuremberg and its legacy that I heard was the one organized by the Royal Irish Academy, which included, you speaking and Professor Philip Sands. His books are very popular. His East-West Street is very popular in Ukraine, which I think is astonishing for, being popular among the non-lawyers. And he said that had he read your book while he was writing East-West Street, his narrative would also have been different. And I think it's so indicative of how even the most prominent scholars and lawyers of the field actually omitted or didn't notice all the aspects, all the contributions to Nuremberg. And I'm particularly grateful to you that you really made the parallels both with the disinformation and with the denazification policy, and of course the memory policy and politics which surrounded Nuremberg, and which of course are so relevant in the current armed aggression against Ukraine. I will ask the questions that I've noted later, if you don't mind. And now I would like to turn to our second speaker, to Professor David Lubang, who is the university professor and professor of law and philosophy at Georgetown University, and who has written very widely on the legacy of Nuremberg. And I'm very interested in also reading his upcoming piece on the Nuremberg principles. Professor Lubang, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to begin, first of all, by expressing my very strong agreement with what Professor Hirsch has said. But I cannot begin to tell you how moving and it is to be able to be here because of the fact that you and your colleagues in a state of national emergency and wartime want to keep the intellectual life of the country and internationally alive it's just incredibly important for those of us in the rest of the world. I cannot express more strongly the admiration for your courage in doing this, and of course the courage of the Ukrainian people right now in this moment of crisis. I want to talk about the substance of the criminal law that came into existence in Nuremberg, where Professor Hirsch was focusing on the narrative of the judgment. I'd like to focus on the Nuremberg Charter itself. So the main piece of substantive law is the three categories of crimes that fall under the subject matter jurisdiction of the Nuremberg Charter. One of them, war crimes, is a very traditional legal category, although the specific war crimes that were indicted and tried at Nuremberg introduced some novelties, but that's not going to be my main focus right now. The two really novel categories are the crimes against peace and crimes against humanity. And one of the things that I've thought about since I first wrote about the legacies of Nuremberg more than 35 years ago is that there is a certain kind of tension between these. So crimes against peace, which criminalizes wars of aggression and wars in violation of international treaties, is a strong affirmation of the importance of national sovereignty, what international lawyers call external sovereignty, that is, control of a country against aggression. And I think that one of the most important sentences in the judgment is this: to initiate a war of aggression is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. Now, that's a quotation from the judgment. Now, in this respect, the Crimes Against Peace article, this is Article 6A of the Nuremberg Charter, harmonizes with the important Article 2 of the UN Charter, which prohibits the threat or use of force against another state's political independence or territorial integrity. So in this sense, at least, the Nuremberg Charter is part of the same revisioning of international law and politics that we find in the United Nations. How do you stop states from first use of force? I do want to emphasize something that Professor Hirsch mentioned, that the supreme irony, that the whole idea of making crimes against peace, of making aggression an international crime, came from the Soviet jurist Aaron Trainin. The irony in the face of the present invasion, I think, speaks for itself. Now, affirming sovereignty is not an entirely happy thing to do, because sovereignty, the appeal to sovereignty has often been used by states in order to resist any attempt to intervene. I'm not talking about military intervention, but in any way against a state's mistreatment of its own people. I mean, this is something that I think we see today in the reaction of Chinese diplomats to international criticism for the crimes against humanity that are going on in Xinjiang province, that even criticizing China for its policies, supposedly an infringement on its sovereignty and a violation of international law. And when I first wrote about Nuremberg, this was, as I say, 35 years ago, around the time of the 40th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials. We were coming out of a decade in which the Latin American dictatorships, South African apartheid, these were very high on the agenda of the international order. And it seemed as though sovereignty was, the appeal to sovereignty was defending the powers of dictatorships to oppress their own people and violate human rights. Now, I think that this is the place in which the crimes against humanity, and to a lesser degree war crimes, becomes an important piece of the Nuremberg Charter, which I think actually helps to reconceptualize sovereignty. So in other words, Article 6A defends the notion of sovereignty, but sovereignty itself is given a different meaning. First of all, the import of making crimes against humanity, that is, attacks on civilian populations and persecution of civilian populations, a crime, means that the sovereign power, internal sovereignty of states, has legal limits. And it's the prohibition on attacking and persecuting civilians under one's control is something that is so important that in the Nuremberg Charter and the Nuremberg Principles, it trumps domestic law, it trumps military orders. And I think that this too brings it into a certain harmony with the project of the United Nations, because the UN Charter places the protection of human rights alongside with maintaining peace and security as the fundamental purposes of the organization. Now, both the Nuremberg Charter and the 1950 Nuremberg Principles, which was the moment at which the law of the Charter became recognized as customary international law, binding on all states, create one other important limitation on sovereignty, and that is that they strip away the immunity of heads of state for criminal punishment. So now leaders are as responsible for international crimes as anyone else. And I think more importantly, the whole notion of raison d'etat is no longer a valid justification or excuse for crimes against peace or crimes against humanity. And I think that one of the important legacies of the Nuremberg Charter is precisely this kind of stripping away or demystifying of what I think of as almost theological commitment to treating states as gods. So raison d'etat, Kriegsraison, these are mysticisms that state leaders and militaries are used for international crimes. And by labeling them as crimes against humanity and war crimes against civilians, I think that whether they knew it or not, the drafters of the Nuremberg Charter are asking for a revised political imaginary, some might put it, a different way of thinking about political violence. Now, obviously, laws and principles like these require enforcement, and they require fair enforcement, but that's impossible in the world of realpolitik. Enforcing them against powerful states and their leaders is often impossible, as Professor Hirsch correctly emphasized. It really would not have been possible for the Allies to prosecute, for example, Harry Truman for dropping atomic bombs, or the revered US Admiral Nimitz for waging the same kind of unrestricted submarine warfare that his German counterpart, Admiral Dönitz, did. So this under-enforcement is really not just the Achilles heel of Nuremberg law, but of international criminal law ever since. And in that sense, at least, the Nuremberg's legacy is very fragile. And the way that I would put it is that the promise of Nuremberg means that its legal innovations make it smaller than itself. But the reason that I was taking care to emphasize how Nuremberg fits together with the entire post-war international order as reflected in the UN Charter and its purposes suggests that Nuremberg is also, in a way, that it's bigger than itself. So the preamble of the Charter says that the aim of this new international order is to protect against the untold sorrow. They're the words that the Charter preamble uses, the untold sorrow of these two wars. So the purposes of the Charter, in which I think the Nuremberg Law forms an important part, are really an entire international order. First, it is an order that is based on sovereignty as a bar to attack from outside. But second, it also carries certain human rights protecting limitations on the nature of sovereignty. Third, it, so to speak, strips away the mysticism that surrounds national leaders and the reasons that they give. And it aims to change the entire way that we think about non-defensive state violence. It's not a sovereign prerogative, but that it's a criminal attack on world order. Now, I think that this is one of the ways in which you can see the current Russian assault on Ukraine as an attempt to really shake an entire order that has done an imperfect but reasonably good job of protecting world peace since the Nuremberg judgment. And in that sense, at least, I think that we really ought to be reaffirming at least these legal innovations of the Nuremberg law and the Nuremberg principles. And I think that I'll stop here, and we have more comments during the question and answer.
Thank you very much, Professor Lubang. And I already have a question about the disaccords between international law and the domestic processes. And especially with the prosecutor Jackson, and there are other examples, but I will still wait and ask them after I give the floor to our third amazing speaker, who's the Professor Gaynel Metro, who's also the judge at the Kosovo Specialist Chambers and the Professor of Law at the University of Amsterdam. And Professor Metro has been also a defense counsel at the ICC and at the other tribunals. And it's very interesting to hear your practical, critical take, both as a perhaps judge and also as a defense counsel on the legacy of Nuremberg. So the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Katerina. And I would like to start by joining my colleagues in thanking you for organizing this event in the current circumstances. And I commend you for it. And that is no doubt a personal act of resistance on your part. And I congratulate you for that. Now, I had initially prepared for quite a different sort of presentation, but the recent events, like for my colleagues, have required me to reshape my presentation. And I have tried to do that to focus on one core feature on the Nuremberg legacy, at least as I see it. And that feature is the fact that the legacy of Nuremberg might not be a settled thing. In other words, I think that we still have to decide what we make of it. To me, the Nuremberg trial contained the seeds and the promise of universal justice and accountability for all those who violate basic norms of international law. There remain three important things to do in order to build upon that promise. The first was to go from what was then a one-off, exemplary sort of criminal justice to a sort of justice that is universal in relevance and in application. Now, at Nuremberg, it's been mentioned already, justice was enforced by the Allies against one side only. And it was called victor's justice for that reason, because it targeted those who had lost the war. Now, in response, the supporters of the process said two things. The first was that military victory had been a precondition to justice. In other words, without military victory, there was no possibility of justice. They also made the point that some justice is better than none. And I think on these two principles, we can agree. The problem is that, as I see it, 70 years later, 70 years after Nuremberg, the promise of universal justice for those who breach international law is still a faraway promise. And it makes the work of institutions such as the ICC particularly uncomfortable, because they must constantly justify their own selectivity. So in the current world order, international criminal justice, as we dreamt it perhaps at Nuremberg, remains very much a case-by-case option rather than an unavoidable occurrence. And for this to change, a critical mass of states must agree to a different prioritization of their commitment to other nations. More on that in a moment, if time permits. But the second thing that the current crisis in Ukraine and in other parts of the world tell us about Nuremberg, in my mind, is that while our forebears at Nuremberg were great legislators, they were poor architects. At Nuremberg, we created many legal concepts. We created new notions of crime against humanity, of persecutions, of crime against peace, and a whole range of new norms and legal principles. So international criminal law, as I practice it today, does not suffer from a lack of norms or prohibition. In fact, we have plenty of those. What is still lacking is or are credible mechanisms and procedures to enforce those, and the institution to go with it to do so effectively. Now, one would wish the ICC to fill that gap, but the record of the institution over the past 20 years suggests that the ICC remains a very weak and fragile institution. Now, yesterday, as you pointed out, the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, has indicated that he will open an investigation into the situation of Ukrainians. Some will see optimism and hope in that. Others, perhaps more cynically, will wonder whether for once the ICC will bring the strong rather than the weak before justice. we still need to see what will happen on that front. Now, for the legacy of Nuremberg to flower and to serve a deterrent purpose, again, I believe that states need to invest politically and diplomatically a great deal more in these means of enforcement of international criminal law than is currently the case. These mechanisms remain way too weak 70 years after Nuremberg. The third echo that Nuremberg brings to my mind when I look at the situation of Ukraine is precisely the lack of deterrence of international criminal law. Now, the underlying premise of criminal law is that not only it will serve to punish the guilty, but it will serve a deterrent and preventive function to prevent the commission of crime. Now, of course, criminal law everywhere has its limit when it comes to prevention and deterrence. The specificities of international criminal law is that penal sanctions are presently a statistical oddity. The probability, in other words, of punishment for someone guilty of a crime against humanity, a war crime or genocide is inversely proportionate to the gravity of the crime. Now, again, there is no one simple solution to improving upon those statistics, but clearly the absolutely necessary change to bring to the system is a reordering of state priorities between political and diplomatic consideration and an attachment to the systematic and universal enforcement of the law. Now, I don't want to suggest that Nuremberg is all that negative, because there's still work to be done in that respect. As a judge at the Kosovo Specialist Chamber and as a former defense attorney for people charged with international crimes, Nuremberg gave us and gave me a number of things. One is a sense of our own history. International criminal law is to a large extent born at Nuremberg. Of course, historians and others will tell you that there were precedents before Nuremberg, that there were traces and signs of what was coming, but Nuremberg is, if there is one place where international criminal law was born, that place. And that gives us a sense of our own history and where to look for the beginning of our own history. It also inspires us in the sense of giving importance to what we try to achieve. Nuremberg was part and parcel of an effort to bring peace to this continent. It also laid down the philosophical foundations for international criminal justice, not just justice in the limited sense, but peace, reconciliation, and truth-telling. It gave us an architecture, a procedure, an adversarial system that we have adopted, and it also gave us precedents in the narrower sense on which to build our law. Take the example of the notion of persecution, a crime against humanity. Nuremberg gave us the meat to put around the bone of that statutory provision 50 and 60 years later, when we had to apply it in the former Yugoslavia, in Cambodia, or in Rwanda. Now, some will criticize the law of Nuremberg for being frozen in the past, for being built and shaped according to what happened during the Second World War. There is truth to that, of course, and the concept of genocide is perhaps the most evident example of this. At the same time, the law that was created at Nuremberg is a law that is very flexible, that contains a lot of plasticity, which has enabled it to develop over the years and to apply to a great variety of places and circumstances. To me, Nuremberg is also a sort of moral compass. When I need to think or to reflect on what I'm doing professionally and what we are trying to achieve, Nuremberg is a good place to have that reflections. It showed the willingness to stay, the expression goes, the hand of vengeance. It also shows the wisdom of our parents and grandparents to give fair and equitable justice to those who could have met a very different fate at the time. And this underlying philosophy and this wisdom of the past is something that I think we still carry with ourselves in the field of international criminal law. Nuremberg is also, for people like me, a bit of a burden, because it carries with it the fantasy, in my mind, that tribunals and judges are there to write the record of history and to tell the world about the causes and circumstances of a conflict. That is a tall order for judges, in my mind, We are only, after all, lawyers and trained in applying the law. But there is talk, of course, in the jurisdictions in which practice of peace, reconciliation, and a whole range of other purposes that are of relevance to us. Now, I want to finish my brief comments by repeating what I said at the beginning, which is that we still have to decide to a large extent what we make of the legacy of Nuremberg. Will it be a faraway point on the horizon that historians will remember and write about, or will we make it a credible first step towards universal accountability that we will enforce in courts and tribunals? Now, I hope for the latter, but I have to say in those days, I fear for the former. And I thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Professor Metro. And I'm also full of the questions. And now we can turn actually to our Q&A session. Those who are present here in the webinar and all those who are watching us on YouTube and Facebook, please, you are very welcome to post your questions and I will read them out loud. And the first question goes to Francine, actually the first two questions, to dear Professor Hirsch. I wanted to ask you about disinformation or the perversion of distortion of information in Nuremberg and in the aggression which is happening nowadays, because we could say that the ability to access information, to ability to read independent media, at least by the Soviet people 70 years ago, was much more limited than that which the Russian people have now. And yet, when we practically are trying to contact our colleagues, well-educated colleagues from different parts of Russia, it seems that they just don't want to avail of those available pages of The Guardian, CNN, and BBC. So how do you think this disinformation policy or the distortion of the narrative policies differ 70 years ago and now, and how can they be countered now when on the one hand we've got so much material, so many critical analysis available, and on the other hand we have a very distorted perception of something which seems to be very apparent and very black and white?
It's a good question and a really important question, and one that I've been thinking a lot about, especially after having conversations this past week with Russian friends and colleagues. And while some of them are openly opposed to what's happening, others really seem to believe that there's a genocide going on, that Russia needs to go in and defend, Russian nationals in Ukraine from. And it's been really hard for me actually to make sense of. That's what prompted me to work on that, to write that piece for Lawfare, was trying to get my mind around actually what's happening, and how is it that people who I love in Russia and who I always thought of as knowledgeable and intelligent people, like how it is that that particular narrative is really hitting home for them, right? And I think I think it's really interesting, this comparison in terms of what kind of information the Soviet people were getting. I think about mostly the period before the war started, right? 1939, the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the secret protocols, and again how the invasion of Poland and the Baltic states was being portrayed, like once again as an act of liberation. And right at that point, information was even more strictly controlled, of course, like with Pravda and Izvestia and official news. And it was much harder to get other sources of information about what was happening in the world. And yet, of course, some people were still skeptical. They understood how to read the newspaper. But now, even with, and now, of course, a lot of Russian news sources have been shut down. But even before that happened, with a variety of news, with RT and with these other news sources, I wish I had an explanation, right, about why people choose to believe in particular narratives and are so resistant to others. I mean, it's not just Russia, of course. I mean, we can see even in America today how disinformation functions. We can see in other countries how disinformation functions. I feel like this is probably one of the biggest problems of our age right now, right? Just along with all the other problems like global warming. So I can't even say that, but it's a huge problem. And in some ways, we have many more sources of information now, right, with the internet, but that also leads to just more sophisticated ways of spreading disinformation as well. I wish this was something that the world could figure out, like international organizations could really figure out how to combat. I feel like it's essential. So so I don't have a clear answer. I think that there are parallels. I think that again, it sets the stage for things. The lack of accurate information and giving people disinformation, it's a powerful tool of war, rather. That's what it is, a powerful tool of war, unfortunately. So I'll stop there. I'd love to hear what other people have to say about that as well, actually.
Yeah. If I could add something to this, I think it's just a fact of modern warfare. I mean, it's probably always been a fact of warfare, but in an internet age, the idea that information wars are just as important in many respects as physical, or what the military says, kinetic wars. It's just a fact of life. Now, why is it that intelligent people believe this? Well, I think that there's motivated thinking. People believe it because they want to believe it. It meets an appetite for, as a psychologist might put it, reducing the cognitive dissonance of thinking that a country that I love is engaged in massive wrongdoing. So I think that this is, this is psychologically, to me, not surprising. It's disappointing. I have seen the same thing in the United States on other issues, where people that I have known for decades still completely believe myths about the election being stolen, and seem impervious to argument. And when they send me news sources, the news sources that they send me, when I take the time to fact check them, they're all bogus. So that's important. Now, how does one stop it? It seems as though it's in the hands of the tech giants to do the policing. Last year, I attended a conference where somebody who was a former US government official and is now the person working at YouTube, who is in charge of taking down misinformation, told me that in the first 2 months after the introduction of vaccines, they took down several million YouTube postings of disinformation. So they are in some sense, for better or for worse, the gatekeepers, and whether they can keep the gate is a very open question.
Thank you very much, Professor Hirsch and Professor Lubang. Professor Hirsch, if I may, just one more follow-up question to you, because I think it also connects the legacy of Nuremberg and the events nowadays. I wanted to ask you about the complicity of the West in the memory and in the narrative, because on the one hand, I myself, being educated in Ukraine, I was told that there was this great patriotic war, and there was, this one dimension of Nuremberg. We weren't really taught about the role and impact of the Western allied powers in. So that's what it was. Of course, that was the typical Soviet and post-Soviet approach of presenting that truth. But then, as I grew older, and in my legal practice, in my policy practice, especially in communication with German politicians, and we saw that in negotiating the sanctions for the current aggression, oftentimes the representatives of the German policymakers would say, there is this guilt, there is something that we do owe to the Russians because of what we did during the World War II. And I would be like, but there were also Ukrainians, and Ukraine and Belarus were, in terms of the territory,
of course,
were more affected. In terms of the number of the population, were more affected. So in a way, the West also was complicit in having this very Soviet and pro-Russian vision of, the World War II, and perhaps also the Nuremberg trial. So how do you think, was it really the case, and how can we incentivize the West to see the more nuanced dimensions of those memories and of those narratives? Or do you think that the current aggression really has helped us, to see those points more clearly?
Wow. So, I mean, this is why history matters, right? And this is why I think historians have to keep doing the work of clarifying and re-clarifying and making sure that we have as much information as possible about the past. When I first started studying the Soviet Union, I started grad school in 1991, right, as the Soviet Union was falling apart. And at that point, people talked about Russia and the Soviet Union, right, as if they were the same thing. And I think we've come a long way since then, at least in the field of history, right? In terms of talking about the fact that that Russia and the Soviet Union are different, and that the Soviet Union was made up of all of these peoples, and many of whom now have their own states. But I think it takes time to get those messages right out to the public and to make people understand that matters, right? That it matters, that you can't just call Russia the Soviet Union, that you have to kind of like open things up and understand those differences. And unfortunately, we're in the middle of this terrible moment, but Ukraine, right, and the other former Soviet states are getting a lot more attention in the news. And maybe this is an opportunity to talk more about the other countries, right, that came out of the Soviet Union and why that matters. So I do think it's a possible opportunity right now. The other thing, that narrative too, when I would teach my history classes, and I would teach my Soviet history class about the Second World War, in American high schools, a lot of times, right, it's people get this message that the US won the war, right, or the Western powers won the war. So it's all these levels that one has to walk people through to get them to a fuller truth. And so sometimes it's just it's a big effort to get people to understand that no, I mean, the Soviet Union sacrificed, the peoples of the Soviet Union sacrificed so much in the war, and their role in the war was decisive. But then again, to take that step further and to talk more about the Ukrainians and the Belarusians and the Georgians, right? I think it's something that we absolutely need to continue to do.
Thank you very much, Professor Hirsch. Professor Mathieu, if I may ask a question to you, please. There's often this phrase that we can hear that there was Nuremberg, and then there was a big gap, and then the ICTR happened. But actually, Professor Lubang mentioned today, this huge transitional justice process which was happening in Latin America. So I was wondering, could you comment on how do you think the legacy of Nuremberg was visible, if at all, in those processes in Latin America? Or when we're speaking about the development of the ICL, we actually do speak about that big gap between the 1945 and then the early 1990s.
Well, I can't really speak to the Latin American aspect of your question, and maybe Professor Lubang is better equipped than me for that part. But what I can tell about the Nuremberg legacy is that in the 1990s, when the idea came up to deal with certain conflicts, in particular in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda, and then in other places, Cambodia, Sierra Leone, and so on and so forth, the Nuremberg legacy weighed heavily. It weighed heavily at the diplomatic level. Madeleine Albright mentioned it as one of the bases on which the ICTY, the Yugoslav Tribunal, was being created. She talked about an echo in this chamber, historical echo to the past. And we, the practitioners in this field, as I mentioned before, very much feel that legacy in what we do, in the way our institutions are shaped, in terms of what we're trying to achieve, not just narrow justice in the sense of the question of guilt or innocence of an accused, but in terms of bringing peace, reconciliation, stability, crystallizing of the rule of law, all of these sub-ambitions, if you wish, of international criminal justice are in some way a heritage of Nuremberg, and so is our law and our procedure. Many of the concepts that we use today haven't changed much since these days, and that says a lot about both the creativity and I think the wisdom as legislator of that time. But again, I must repeat what I've said before. I think at the same time, it's created an illusion. The illusion being that criminal justice is the solution to all problems. It might form part of a solution in terms of bringing justice to those who've suffered harm. However, the situation in Ukraine right now is not going to be resolved by a new tribunal or by criminal prosecutions. At this stage, criminal justice and criminal investigations can serve as leverage on those who don't necessarily fear the law because they're too high in the hierarchy to be concerned by it, but those who are maybe slightly lower in the hierarchy and who are the implementing hands of others. And those ones might be sensible to the threat of prosecution. But again, while I look forward and take some comfort in the announcement of the ICC, I have been long enough in this field to know that if the ICC does anything concrete about Ukraine, it's going to take a long, long time. And one of the extraordinary things I think about Nuremberg that we sometimes forget, it's how quickly they were able to put together an architecture, to put together a narrative, to put together a case, which for some of us will take decades or two. At Nuremberg, this was done there and then in no time. And that's why it's also a place and remains a place of inspiration to the people like me who would wish their justice to be that bit more effective.
Thank you very much, Professor Matura. Professor Lubang, perhaps you could comment on that Latin American aspect and how the international criminal law and the legacy of Nuremberg developed there before the establishment of the specialized Rwandan and Yugoslav tribunals.
Well, I think it developed, yeah, thank you. I think it developed unevenly in that one of the phenomena that we saw was amnesties. For example, in Chile, which was a very political decision in order for the military dictatorship to agree to give up power. The military had to be guaranteed amnesty, and it wasn't until the wake of the Pinochet decision that the amnesties were stripped away, and it took years in Argentina as well. I don't think that the situations were parallel enough, so I don't see much of a direct impact. And the reason is this: as in many transitional justice situations, one of the big questions is, do you want to forget so that people can live side by side? So victims and their survivors can live side by side with the perpetrators and their families who aren't going anywhere. So do you want reconciliation, truth and reconciliation, wiping the slate clean and forgetting? I think the way that Spain, the deal that Spain made when it transitioned away from dictatorship, or where does criminal justice fit in with that? Those are the questions that were raised in Latin America and elsewhere during transitions. And I don't think that those are parallel to Nuremberg, where it was not necessary to deal with the question of living side by side with the perpetrator, at least internationally. I mean, the victorious allies didn't have the vanquished Germans as their next door neighbors. I think that there was transitional justice in Germany, and that was very difficult, but I don't think that the Nuremberg trials had a particular effect on it. Now, in Latin America, I have not studied all the various Latin American criminal codes, but I do know that in Argentina, crimes against humanity was added to the criminal code. and some of the perpetrators from the junta era were prosecuted for crimes against humanity. Likewise, in Peru, I think President Fujimori was convicted of crimes against humanity. So pieces of the positive law made its way in, but I think not at the time of the transitions.
Thank you very much, Professor Lubang. And Professor Matura, over to you, if I may, again, in the context of this recent announcement by the ICC prosecutor that he would proceed with the Ukraine situation, there were also the increasing calls to launch the domestic proceedings under the universal jurisdiction principle into the alleged war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression concerning the Russia-Ukraine armed conflict. How do you assess the prospects of these proceedings generally, and especially with respect to the crime of aggression? Sorry, you unmuted.
Let me start by giving you the bad news, and I'll try to give you some good ones as well. The bad news is typical prosecution for international crimes are extremely difficult to investigate and to bring to court for a whole range of reasons. Access to evidence. You won't have access to intelligence used by the other side. You won't have targeting information that the other side has and has no interest to give to you. The traces of the crimes might be destroyed if a building is destroyed, if the archives you're interested in are being destroyed. Access to the territory, access to witnesses that could be relevant to your case are difficult. So that is the bad news. Now, thankfully, there is increasingly a number of both professional and mechanisms that deal with these sorts of cases. The ICC is one place of justice. As I've mentioned, it hasn't quite delivered yet on the promises that were made 20 years ago. So it's one of the potential vehicles for anyone to wish to access justice to go to the other one, which I think is perhaps more effective in terms of what you are trying to achieve at this stage as well, at least, which is leverage. You want the law to be relevant to the calculus that is being made in Moscow or in other places. You want them to think of those consequences, even if they are in theory relatively remote. And the first thing you can do to try to achieve that, the most important, is to record what's happening on the ground. It has sometimes taken 30 to 40 years for justice to be made. Professor Lubang mentioned examples in South America. You could mention Cambodia as well, where victims had to wait 40 years to get to a place of justice. Now, the most important in any criminal case is the quality and the reliability of the information you are able to gather. That is what you want to organize in the first place if you think that criminal prosecutions have a place here. The second thing which you need to figure is where to go with it afterwards. And there is a thing called grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, which is built in every one of the 4 1949 Geneva Conventions, which people forget about, but which was a massive achievement following the Second World War. There was Nuremberg and its judicial achievements on the one hand, and there were the Geneva Convention as great advances in humanitarian law. And in each and every one of them, there's a small body of criminal law called the grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions that have something quite extraordinary built in them, which is the duty of every state to investigate them. In other words, my country, Switzerland, has a duty to investigate grave breaches in Ukraine if it's happening today. Now, you may think it's theory, but if there's will, there's a way. The second thing that is built in that system is a compulsory mechanism of universal justice. In other words, again, take Switzerland. If there were to be a state official suspected of committing or participating in a grave breach in Ukraine or in other parts of the world that is traveling to Geneva for this or that reason, Switzerland would have automatic and compulsory jurisdiction over it. So in other words, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You don't need to create new institutions. You don't even have to wait for the ICC to kick into place. You have the mechanisms in place today to commence the process. Now, of course, as with almost every effort in international criminal justice, the difficult questions is, are states willing to do that? Do they have the political and diplomatic will and stamina effectively to take on Russia and to prosecute cases on behalf of Ukraine. And that will require, I'm afraid, quite a bit of lobbying and convincing by the people who want to get justice for what's happening right now on the ground.
Thank you very much, Professor Hirsch.
Yeah, I wanted to just continue this conversation because I think it's a really important one about deterrence and again, thinking about how to, why have the Nuremberg principles, why have the international law institutions that we have now, like why have they failed to deter, right? I think about in my own work with Aaron Trainin, how part of what motivated the Soviets to come up with these arguments about crimes against peace were the arguments that the old international system, League of Nations, those institutions, that they did nothing to deter aggressive war, and they didn't even consider aggressive war. It was a criminal defense, but not a punishable criminal defense, right? And now we have this international system that's been in place, right? After Nuremberg, we have an international criminal court. So going forward, I guess it's a question for the other panelists, like what do we have to do in the future to create a more robust system that would actually deter? Like, do we need different institutions? Do we, like, what do you imagine that something would have to look like?
Yeah. If I could jump in, first of all, I think that it's too simple to talk about a failure of these institutions to deter for the reason that we actually don't know about how many war crimes have been deterred. That is, we have to look at the war crimes that weren't committed. And I think the mechanism of that kind of deterrence, insofar as it's happened, has been that, among other things, international law has informed the way in which militaries train their troops and their officers, so that the crimes don't happen. Obviously, this is not 100% deterrence. Also, just for the mention the one scholarly empirical study that I know of, whether the ICC has any deterrent power, has found that it has a mild deterrent power. And this is a paper by Beth Simmons and Hyoran Jo, J-O, that was published in the journal International Organization. And what they found was that in countries that were in otherwise parallel countries that were undergoing internal armed conflicts, that those that had joined the ICC, the government troops, were committing fewer war crimes than those that hadn't joined the ICC. And it's a modest finding, but it actually I thought was interesting because I had never thought that it would be even possible to do an empirical test of the deterrent power. Now, what could be done to deter major crimes by major powers is, I think, a political question. I think there is nothing that the law by itself can do to deter a major power that's bent on violating the law, that it has to be political pressure that stops it or military defeat that stops it. But the law only, especially in this area, only exists to the extent that it has the support of political authorities. I did want to make a comment about, I thought one of the questions that you asked earlier about what the implications of Nuremberg are for domestic prosecutions. And I think that would include universal jurisdiction prosecutions, including for grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. I think that those are modest at best. I mean, I'm not going to talk about the practical difficulties of doing it or the political downsides that states sometimes see in it. But the problem is that one of the Nuremberg innovations, which is stripping away immunities of high government actors, exists only in international tribunals, not in national tribunals. So for relations between states, the principle that equals have no dominion over equals, para imparem non habet imperium, is still the law. And there have been a number of what I consider very regressive legal decisions by both the International Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights, in which the question has been squarely posed of which matters more, preserving sovereign immunity or making an exception for violations of the jus cogens. And in the Germany versus Italy case in the ICJ, in the arrest warrants case in the ICJ, in Jones versus United Kingdom and Al-Adsani in the European Court of Human Rights, the courts have taken a very, I think, reactionary view toward this and said that it doesn't matter if it's a jus cogens violation, of which, by the way, aggressive war is a jus cogens violation, although that wasn't the issue in these cases. Sovereign immunity continues to reign supreme. Now, in 2017, the International Law Commission made a proposal to strip away at least some immunity for from leaders who commit genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, apartheid, torture, and forced disappearance. They still have not stripped away, even in that proposal, does not strip away head of state immunity. But realistically, what that means is that high officials can't be prosecuted in the courts of other states because of an immunity that still has not been canceled. So that's unfortunately the bad news.
If I may add some good news to Professor Lubang's dark painting, the first thing I want to perhaps answer to Professor Hirsch's question is there are indications that when states put their mind to it, they can do a good job of it. And I will take the example of the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY. Every single defendant ever charged by the institution who lived to see his day in court was brought to court. And it did a number of things which go towards the ultimate purpose of prevention and deterrence. It built a credible institution, at least as far as the former Yugoslavia is concerned, of course, but it created a precedent in the broad sense of the term that led to the ICC, again, a step in the right direction. It created law that is deterrent. It created law not only that applied before that jurisdiction, but that became pervasive. That is now the law of the ICC, that is the law of many other states. Now, if states want to achieve the same on a broader scope, they can. The political resistance, of course, will be commensurate to a more ambitious agenda, as the ICC illustrates. But that goes back to what I have said before. It's for states to accept that the order of priorities that they set for themselves and for their relations to other nations are guided in part by their commitment to international law and international criminal law in particular. And if justice is good for the goose, it's good for the gander, as the expression goes. In other words, if one day one of your friends in good places is subject to procedure, that you have to let go of it and allow it to happen. Now, where I take a bit of a more optimistic view than Professor Lubang is in the fact that many of these historical features of sovereignty, which started to crack at Nuremberg and quite significantly at Nuremberg, are cracking even harder these days. Immunities being the best examples of that. I think the situation is a much more hopeful one than with respect to what Professor Lubang said. There are quite a number of cases now at the domestic level where, including in my country of Switzerland, where the view has been taken, including by our highest court of the land, that immunities don't apply in respect of international crimes. Now, of course, there's a constant tension, and there's no resolution yet of this tension between sovereign concerns and priorities of states and the demands associated with the punishment of international crimes. But I would not renounce too easily or too fast the idea that one day we might find ourselves in a normative environment where immunities don't exist anymore and the possibility of justice has less and less normative impediment in the world.
I would just like to join in saying that I hope this happens as well. And I will mention that there was a recent collection of reflections on the Nuremberg principles on the anniversary, in which the contributors, who included myself, were asked if we could add one principle to the 7 Nuremberg principles. What would it be? And mine was the stripping away of immunities. So maybe this will happen.
Hopefully. Thank you, Professor Lubang. And actually, we've got a question to you from the member of the audience. So Kieran Mohandas-Menon is asking, in terms of the legacy of Nuremberg, do you think the legacy would have been strengthened or twisted if the International Law Commission members were more explicitly allowed to interpret or apply their mind during the formulation of the Nuremberg principles? What is your take?
I wish I could answer that with a historian's eye, because I actually don't know who was on the International Law Commission at the time in 1950 and 49 and 50, and what negotiations they went to. I think they were taking a very cautious view that was trying not to go beyond what was in the Nuremberg Charter and the Nuremberg judgment, because let's just remind you of the context. They had been charged with the General Assembly of extracting from the Nuremberg proceedings what the principles were of binding customary international law. So, for example, they left out a couple of the key articles in the Nuremberg Charter, namely the ones that had to do with charging groups with crimes. Those didn't exist in the Tokyo Charter, the Far East Charter, and I think the ILC decided that they couldn't, in good conscience, say that represented customary international law yet. So if they'd been allowed to expand on it, maybe they would have come up with something that was stronger, but it had to get a ratification from the General Assembly as representing principles of customary international law. And let's just be clear about had that not happened, then we would have just had pure and simple victor's justice. We would have had law that was applicable only to crimes committed by members of the Axis. So I think that the General Assembly approving the ILC's Nuremberg principles and saying these are not just the law imposed by 4 victorious powers on a handful of defeated powers, but these actually represent customary international law was extremely important. But to be customary international law, it has to reflect the state practice and juristic opinion of most states. So I think that it probably did about as good a job of boiling down the state of the law at that time as could be done.
Thank you very much, Professor Lubang. And Professor Hirsch, I wanted to ask you actually slightly touched upon that. So this policy of alleged denazification of Ukraine, which President Putin announced a week ago, do you think the similarities with the purges, with the persecution, which was actually perpetrated in the 1930s, basically when the opposition and the intellectuals were exterminated and sent to Siberia, or do you think we will have more optimistic prognosis about his policy now?
Oh, wow, that's a horrible thing to speculate on, actually, in some ways, but it is something that I've been greatly worried about, because I think anytime, this is what we know about the law, that it can be misused and manipulated, right, to all kinds of ends. And just even going back and thinking about the role of someone like Aaron Trainin, who came up with this language of crimes against peace and crimes against peaceful citizens, Trinan came up with some of that language, especially the language about complicity at the time of the Moscow show trials. And so some of the same language, that's one of the horrible ironies of it, right? That some of the same language that was used to prosecute innocent people in the Soviet Union for a crime that they did not commit. And by the way, during the show trials, one of the denunciations of Trotsky and others was that they were working for the fascists. So this is a really old claim about fascists and Nazis, even then in the 30s. So that's the same concepts could be used for one way domestically, and then could be taken for an international military tribunal and used for a different end for bringing justice at the end of a war. So I think that's the thing, that all of this language, these language institutions, they can be used for any kind of end. And I do fear when I keep hearing this language of denazification, when I hear the language of these people being quote unquote brought to justice, it's, again, that's why I keep seeing these parallels with Poland, right, in particular, and then parallels with post-war Poland as well, where after Poland in June of 1945, there was a show trial in Moscow for members of the Polish underground who had been people who had been anti-fascist. And they're of course, after being interrogated by the NKVD and probably tortured, right? They confessed to collaborating with the Nazis. So I think that's something we should have, again, and what is the answer? It's to be for us as scholars to be aware of it, to keep pointing that out. And then I don't know then what is the answer for policymakers. How do we, I think that's the horrible thing, and why I feel so helpless so much of the time now, is that we can see what's going on and we can see the danger signs of things, and we can call those danger signs out and try to make people aware of these historical parallels and how this kind of language has been used in the past. But then as scholars, it's hard to know, is there something else that we can do in terms of helping to organize in the international community? I mean, that's the thing that I'd like to know more about, what you think. Like, is there something that we as scholars can do now to try to, from our homes, wherever we are, right, where we're not in the middle of an invasion, to try to bring more attention to these things in a way that would actually have an impact?
Thank you. Yes, I think two things for sure. It's definitely writing and debunking those myths, the way Timothy Snyder, and Applebaum do, and I'm sure you do in your conversations. And second, we actually call for the suspension of the cooperation with the Russian institution that support the regime of this narrative. We definitely don't want, and I think it would be unjust for the individuals to suffer, those who don't support these narratives. But if the institutions validate that, and if they still can benefit from good foreign grants or foreign corporations, I think it's something which should not be accepted. And actually, we see the institutions from the wide array of fields, including culture, which is, Russians like to say is beyond politics, taking this path. So I think it was just today or yesterday that Metropolitan Opera announced they had suspended the contract with, I think was with Valery Gergiev from the Mariinsky Theatre, because he validated President Putin's policy concerning Syria and Ukraine. And I think also with Anna Netrebka, who is also supportive of the president. So at least taking this institutional take, I think is important. And then when it's done on a more massive level, hopefully it makes an impact. And I don't support, Ukrainians being starry-eyed about international justice or the ICC, but hopefully, cumulatively, this sober approach to, the court in The Hague, and then the universal jurisdiction proceedings, and then hopefully to good initiatives actually in Ukraine could make a difference. Thank you, Professor Silvani. You wanted to make this comment. Yes, another cultural reaction. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, I'm so grateful to you. I know that I've been awful in organizing that, and you've been so kind both with our first communication and now to really organize that on such a short-term notice. I'm deeply grateful to it, and I did receive the messages from my colleagues, again, many of whom are in the shelters, that they would want this, and they are so happy about, still the ICC investigation hopefully happening. So I'm just hoping that we'll have more discussion and more practical implementation of these discussions soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting this.
Thank you very much. Have a kind afternoon and peaceful afternoon.
You too.
You too.
Thank you.